All right, so if you are living on the south side of Temple's campus, you are very likely living in a room that has cooking appliance in it, either a gas stove or an electric stove. If you're living on the first 3 floors of 1300, probably not. So before we get started with the how to use a stove part of the video, we're going to talk a little bit about cooking safety. There's 3 things that I want to highlight. There's probably many more that will make a lot of common sense, but these 3 things are things we see happen a lot. The first thing I want to say before we get started about any of the stove features is make sure you're present while you're cooking. If you've got something sauteing on the stove with a pan, or you're using the broil feature in the oven, that is active cooking. You need to be in front of the stove and present so that if conditions change with your food, if the oil gets too hot, if something happens on the stove, a small fire or whatever, you're present and can deal with that situation by turning the heat off, lowering the heat, moving a pan over to an inactive burner. If you're baking a cake and you've got the steps set and the oven is doing what it's doing, and you walk back to the bedroom every now and then, that's not a big deal. But for active cooking things, you really need to be present. The second thing I'll say about cooking safety is, particularly for our Temple Towers residents who have a stove like this, which are gas powered, all of the other stoves in 1300 and Morgan are electric stoves, so that doesn't apply. But here in Temple Towers, all the stoves are gas. Gas smells like rotten eggs when it's not being burnt. So if you walk into your apartment or you come out of your bedroom and you smell that like weird rotten egg smell that is attributable to gas in the city of Philadelphia, come over to your stove and before you panic, check to make sure these dials on the front are all in the off position. And finagle them to make sure that they're in the off position. They typically don't come out of that off position very easily, so I can wiggle all these knobs and they really kind of stay in place. Whereas if I had the gas flowing, these knobs are going to move a bit more freely. So definitely double check that. If you can't figure out that that's the cause of it, first thing I tell you to do, open the windows and then call for an emergency response, either through Temple Police or to the front desk, so that they can come up and check out what's going on in the apartment. The third thing that I say about cooking safety is don't get in the habit of placing things on top of the burners. Flammable items like towels or boxes should never be left on top of the burner. I've definitely seen the case where, particularly where you've got roommates and you walk in and you're coming in, you got this pizza box, I just need to set it down somewhere, the stove happens to be in your path, you sit it down and walk away, and another roommate comes along and doesn't really think about it, starts to turn the stove on, and there's something flammable on top of the stove. That is particularly true of the stoves in the buildings that are not gas, where it's more of a heating element. So just make it good practice, don't place things on top of the stove unless you're cooking. Particularly in the beginning of the school year, with people that have never lived in the building before, we get a lot of questions and some work orders and even some emergency calls about the smell of gas in an apartment. So some people we realize have never literally used a gas stove before, and here you are on campus and it's your first time. So I'll go through some of the features real quick. We'll talk about the oven first. So this is the typical stove that you'll get here in Temple Towers. There will be some variations, so your buttons may not be in exactly the same spot, but it's the same general idea. Up here at the top, the button that most people are going to be focusing on is the bake button. There's also a broil button. I'll talk about what those features are in a minute. Over here in the middle, you have the time, and then you've got some indicator lights here, one for the oven, one for the preheat, and one for the door locked feature, which will come with the self-cleaning. We do not recommend you use self-cleaning on our ovens. So for the bake feature, you would press the bake button, and then next use the up and down buttons to set the temperature. This particular stove defaults the oven to 350 degrees, but if you need 375, just push the up arrow until you get there. If you need 325, for example, you can push the button or hold it down to get to 325. If you do that, the oven will automatically come on, and now you've got the green oven indicator light, and your preheat light will come on. So the oven obviously is not going to be 300 degrees when you just walk up to it. The gas is going to ignite, and the oven is going to start to get warm, and as the temperature inside the oven gets close to 325 in this case, the oven will beep and the preheat light will come off, and that means that your oven is now at 325 or 350 or whatever you set it to. So in the oven, the baking feature has heat that comes from the bottom of the oven and heats the entire space of the oven to get it to that temperature that you set it to, which is more of a cooking method around the entire item that's in the oven, whether it's a cake or a piece of meat or vegetables. The other option that you have is to use the broil feature. Broiling is kind of like oven frying, essentially. The broil feature will work by setting a temperature either high or low, and when you leave it on and you press start, you can immediately put your item inside the oven on the top rack, and the heat will come from the top of the oven and give whatever item is in the oven a broiled finish, or it'll cook it from the top essentially at close proximity. Broiling would be considered similar to having a saute pan on the stove, which is active cooking. So if you're using the broiler, you need to be present in front of the oven to monitor your food and the cooking progress. But once the broiler is on, you notice the preheat function is not turned on here. It means that the oven is now ready to go already with your broiling feature, so you can put your items in the oven. The oven is now on. And that heat will be coming from the top of the oven, not the bottom of the oven like it does when you're baking. To turn the oven off, you can press your clear and off button. After a minute or so, the gas inside the oven will shut off, the flame will go away. The oven will still be hot for a period of time inside, so make sure you're careful using an oven mitt or whatever to grab whatever you're taking out of the oven, not to touch the sides, the top, or the racks. They'll all be very hot. But over time, that oven will cool off and eventually will come back down into matching whatever your room temperature is. This is a fairly typical version of a stove you'll see here in Temple Towers, but only in Temple Towers. You won't find these in 1300 or in the Morgan complex, and there are no stoves anywhere on the north end of campus. So we're doing these videos because we realize that a lot of students come to campus and may have an induction stove at home or an electric cooktop, and you arrive to campus in Temple Towers and suddenly you have a gas stove, and it may be one of the first times you've seen one. So we're going to go through some of the quick features and things to kind of look out for. On this stove in particular, there are 4 burners, and most of the stoves that we use at the university, there are 4 burners. There are 2 regular burners that produce what we call medium heat or standard heat. There is 1 burner here in the front that's labeled the Power Plus burner. This is a burner that you will use mostly for high heat cooking and for boiling water. And then you have a simmer burner here in the back, which is also labeled here on the front, simmer burner. This is great for cooking sauces that are going to be on the stove for a little bit longer, or something that you don't need as much heat to use to cook. So again, 4 burners. Each burner has a knob in the front that corresponds to it, and most have a diagram that shows exactly where on the stove that burner is that knob corresponds to. Each knob has letters on it and lines that indicate where they should line up with the line here on the stove. Some of the stoves are older, obviously, so some of the buttons may be a bit more faded, or some of the lines are faded. But again, every stove is built so that that line is facing straight up, perpendicular from the front of the stove. So in this case, if you wanted to turn on this left front burner, you would use the leftmost burner here, and you're going to turn it to the left, to the lighting position. It's going to click. And when that flame comes on, then you'll be able to turn this knob to the right or to the left to increase the amount of gas coming through that burner. So if you want it on high, there's an indicator here to get that to high. And if you want to turn it down, you turn it to the right where the numbers are lower till you get to the low point. One thing that I see happen a lot, and I'll demonstrate it here for you, is that when you get down to low, sometimes you can barely even see that flame that's coming out of the stove, and people think that it's off. But again, the stove is never off unless this is in the off position. And when it goes off, that knob pops out. You push that knob in to relight the stove. You don't want to leave it where you hear that clicking noise. That means that the igniter is trying to light the flame. Doesn't need to be on once the flame comes out. You can then set the flame to the heat level you'd like. When you're done, turn it off and hear that click at the end. Same thing would be true for any of the other burners. We're going to do the power burner now. Again, you're going to hear that clicking noise in the beginning. You definitely do not want to leave it in that position. Once you get the flame to come on, turn it down. Sometimes in the beginning of the year, after housekeeping has come through and done the full clean on the stoves before you move in, you go to use the stove for the first time, and the flame may not come on right away. They're all going to do it now because we're recording the video. But just give it a second. Let that clicking noise come on, the gas will come out, and eventually that will light and turn it down. If you hear that clicking noise, gas is flowing. So if you don't get the flame to come out quickly, go ahead and turn it off and retry. If you have any issues with using the stove beyond what we've covered in the video, go ahead and file a maintenance request. Gas stoves are insanely reliable, but sometimes things happen, and we'll send a technician up to take a look and see if there's something that we need to fix for you.